All right, all right. Welcome back to the Activist Summit on RBN. My special guest is Dr. Jill Stein. She was a former Green Party candidate for president. Jill, thanks so much for coming back.
The honor is mine. Thank you so much, Savvy. Really excited about this conference.
Awesome, awesome. So we're going to be discussing political rebellion for this panel. Now, Jill, I know you are no stranger to pushing back against the duopoly. I do want to start off with a clip here. You've probably seen this before, but this is from Democracy Now! And this was actually when Bernie Sanders was telling viewers, this is not the time for a protest vote. So I want to play this small clip, and I do want to get your thoughts on this and where do you think we should go from here for those of us that are voters and those of us that are political activists.
In an interview with MSNBC's Chris Hayes, Senator Sanders explained his opposition to a protest vote.
You disagree with Hillary Clinton on this or that. You may not like her on every respect, but look at issues that impact your lives, your children's lives, the future of this country, and you will end up concluding that right now is not the time to be supporting a protest vote. Right now, we have to make sure that Trump does not become president.
That is Senator Sanders. Ralph Nader, your response.
Well, it is a time for Senator Sanders to mobilize as he can. All his supporters around the country with mass rallies to put the heat on both candidates. Is anything wrong with that? He should have a mass rally in the mall and then spread it all over the country. So you have civic pressure, citizen pressure coming in on all the candidates to further the just pathways of our society. Why doesn't he do that?
Okay. Jill, I want to get your take on that. When Bernie Sanders said now is not the time for a protest vote, it's interesting because Donald Trump won anyway.
Yeah, won in spite of Bernie Sanders' complete surrender, rolling over, trying to deliver his support back into the Democratic Party, which unfortunately is kind of what he always does. But he's right. It's not time for a protest vote. It's time for a power vote. This isn't about protest. This isn't some kind of ritual symbolism. This is about asserting power. And, there's just a gazillion reasons why we have to assert power because, essentially there is no alternative. And we've seen, where have we gone since 2016? Just deeper into the dark hole of neoliberalism, with the Democrats now leading the charge for endless war, for nuclear confrontation, for continuing giveaways to the banks, for false climate solutions, the much vaunted, hyped Inflation Reduction Act not only doesn't reduce inflation, but it doesn't really address the underlying causes, which is essentially corporate greed. It also doesn't even address the climate. It's touted as the climate bill, but it's really a fossil fuels first bill. And for anybody who missed the footnote on that bill, while it's called the climate bill, what it really does is deliver public resources to fossil fuels in order to have any major public land or offshore waters utilized for renewable energy and for holding back climate Armageddon. You have to first, every year, utilize 2 million acres of onshore land plus 60 million acres of offshore land for fossil fuels before you can even get to the starting gate on renewables. So, and then once you get past the fossil fuels first, then it's a false solution bill that includes every bit as much so-called clean coal, which doesn't exist, the so-called carbon sequestration, as if you can keep generating more carbon dioxide and then just magically take it out of the air. This is just, look at where we've gone, in the 6 years since Bernie Sanders was kind of sheepdogging people back into the Democratic Party. It's more of the same. And what's different is that we don't have any more margin of safety, not on climate and not on war and not on nuclear weapons, and certainly not on the economy either, because if you look at what Biden and the Democrats have delivered, and they could have delivered something. How did the Democrats lose their commanding majority in the first place? Well, if you look at what's happened since Obama, was it, the Greens or the socialists took it away from them? That's what they are trying to say about the presidency, but that's complete and utter bullshit. Obama lost something like 13 Senate seats and somewhere around 64, 68 House seats after he threw Main Street under the bus and gave away the store to Wall Street. So the Democrats have been punished ever since Obama's peak in 2012. They've progressively lost their majority. And in fact, they even had a 2/3 majority, so they could have done whatever they want. And what did Obama promise, among many other things? First thing he was going to do, this is the same thing that Joe Biden is saying now, first thing he would do is codify Roe v. Wade and protect women's reproductive freedom. Biden is saying that now, facing midterms. Just reelect, Democrats, give us our thin majority again, don't punish us, and we will reward you by delivering on codifying Roe v. Wade, ensuring that it gets written into law so we're not depending on a Supreme Court decision that could be reversed. This has been the story for, 50 or 60 years. So how much further can we go down this rabbit hole? This rabbit hole, we know where it goes. It goes to continuing economic, crushing economic inequality, endless war, verging on nuclear, climate catastrophe, the destruction of our democracy, which is ongoing. This is a well-established trend. It didn't just happen under Obama, didn't start under Bush, didn't start under Clinton. This has really been going on certainly since FDR, since we had a New Deal, which had its limits, but it was kind of our peak of economic justice, and it's been rolled back ever since. And it's been two parties in collusion, not only to deliver to Wall Street and the war machine, but also to really shut down political options. And, I think it's part of rebellion. The real driver for rebellion is social movements, hands down. That's really what got us the progress from the labor movement or the civil rights movement, and even the environmental movement. It's really coming from the movement in the street, women's rights, reproductive rights. It's the drivers in the streets. But unless you also challenge power, you're giving them a license to just write you off. And I take my guidance here, especially from Frederick Douglass, who said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. That demand needs to be in every space. It needs to be on the street, in the social space, and don't give them a pass. That's just what they want you to do. They want you to give up on contesting for political power. We have to fight.
One of the things. Hold on, I'll mute you for a second because there's an echo. One of the things that has come up too, there has been, I think, a lot of people upset with Bernie Sanders' movement, progressives that have gone in through the Democratic Party. At the same time, there are also people who feel like they're the best that we got and we should give them a chance. And to that, I push back, because what I have noticed is if you have someone like Bernie Sanders run on these progressive issues 2 election cycles in a row, and both times he loses and he tells you, vote for Hillary Clinton, vote for Joe Biden. If the progressives that lose, if they're just going to tell you to vote for the corporate Democrat who they told you should be fighting against, you should be fighting against people taking this big money interest going into Congress and going into the presidency. If they're going to go ahead and tell you to vote for them anyway, then I have to ask, what is the point of the progressive movement and the Justice Democrats at this time?
Yeah. And we've seen them kind of unravel. They entered the scene with lots of accolades that AOC was going to be, was going to really challenge power. She was going to be a one-term congressperson, and, come hell or high water, she was going to do the right thing. It didn't matter who was going to attack her or undermine her. She was going to do the right thing, and we've seen where that went. We've seen where the, the 7 or 8 person, solidarity group of progressives, where's that gone? They haven't used their power when they could have used their power. They just don't stand up. And now they're using their power to silence progressives and silence the peace movement and accuse the peace advocates of being Putin, Putin puppets. It's like what hit me in 2016, where I was accused of being a Putin puppet for participating, in this press extravaganza in Moscow that allowed me to speak to India and China and, the Canadian broadcasting system. Virtually everybody was there, and I had a chance to air a distinctly different platform from what people automatically assume is the US, because it's what's been US policy for centuries, and that is, a peace offensive in the Middle East to stop the bombing, all the bombing, the US bombing as well as the Russian bombing, a global Green New Deal, and basically a wide and peace and justice program, and the end of nuclear weapons, which was a big issue in our campaign, and was at the time that I went to Moscow. And I went there hoping I could talk to Putin, but of course I wasn't allowed to talk to Putin. He sat at the table for a few minutes, but he only spoke Russian and was surrounded by Russians. And the only person I talked to was the guy sitting next to me, who was the former German foreign minister who had been part of kind of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and what happened at that point. It was an interesting conversation, but unfortunately I didn't have a word to say to Putin, but I did get to speak at the conference where I delivered that message. And ever since I am, labeled as a Putin puppet, because it's very dangerous to be a peace advocate, especially in a world that is sick of war. And here at home in the US, people are already sick of war, and public support is much stronger for putting our resources to work here at home, where they're urgently needed for housing and healthcare and get out of student debt and all that. And that is, that's just not, that's what people want. Unfortunately, what our electeds want is to just keep delivering to their corporate sponsors on Wall Street and in the fossil fuel industry and the war machine. And that's not what people want, not in this country and not abroad either. So it's really important to fight off the bullshit that tells us that we are powerless. We are not powerless. We are potentially extremely powerful, and we are numerous. And the challenge is to really to combat that illusion of powerlessness and to help mobilize our forces and build solidarity at the community level on up, which is what you guys are doing here today. So thank you very much.
And I want to mention too, because I'm not sure if everyone is aware of this. I talked about this, I think about a week ago, But people need to understand why this is so problematic when you do have like progressives there and they're not fighting for us. If you actually look at the principles of Justice Democrats, these are the things that they're supposed to be doing. And there's two that really stood out to me as problematic right now. One of them is ending arms sales to countries that it says violate human rights. And they list the countries: Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt. And I think we all know how the voting went for the Iron Dome. And the other one here is implementing, and this is the one that I think a lot of people don't know about, implementing instant runoff voting nationwide in an effort to make third-party and independent candidates more viable. And this piece, which I think is very crucial, was never implemented. And it was supposed to be a part of that Justice Democrat strategy. So now we're stuck with what we have. And then if you wanted to look at the foreign policy issue, when we criticize them, it's really important that you point to examples. So this is what was said to me. Bree did educate me about this, that when you do criticize them, point to examples of what they've done wrong and what they should be doing. So a specific example here, the ending the arms sales to countries that violate human rights. There's another one here about ending practice of unilaterally waging war, except as a last resort to defend U.S. territory. So these are the principles that they signed on to. And I was told that they did sign a pledge and they're not doing it. So it's really important that you go back to the original principles that they all agreed to do. And when you brought up like the issue with the funding for the war, we see all this money going to Ukraine constantly. They're trying to send another package to Ukraine. It's really important. So for those of you that show up at these protests, or you show up to confront them, just like Jose did recently at AOC's town hall. There was another event that she was at in Astoria, Queens, where people were protesting. Ayanna Pressley was just confronted about if she supports BDS by student activists. When you confront them, make sure you go back to those principles, because that is something that they agreed to do and to follow. I think that's important to point out.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it's through misstatements like that they kind of incentivize people who are on the verge of breaking away not to break away and to go to the Justice Democrats, because look, they have all these great principles, but then they abandon the principles. I mean, some of us who've been around for a while, whose hair is the color of mine, have seen this over and over and over again. So when I was growing up in the 60s, this thing was called the realignment movement. And it was an effort to bring together labor, which was running really strong at the time, and the civil rights movement. And what happened was that it completely floundered on the rocks of the war machine, which, both parties have upheld forever. But because of the positions that Martin Luther King took, and which they were just cannon fodder, because of that position, this coalition just kept breaking up and it couldn't make it. And that's been the case ever since. The first time I was tricked into running for office back in the year 2000, when I was induced by the Green Party. I wasn't a member of any party, and at the time, induced by the Greens to run for governor here in Massachusetts. At that time, the Democrats had just killed campaign finance reform, which was the clean elections law that sat in the legislature for years. And finally, it was passed by voter referendum by a huge 2-to-1 margin, that people wanted to get big money out of politics and create an alternate funding stream. And we passed that. And the Democrats then basically took a voice vote in a party caucus and decided to basically not provide the funding for that bill. So it was demolished. And it was really clear to me at that time in the year 2000 that the Democrats were a hopeless case, which I had kind of seen demonstrated for decades in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And this was like in the late 90s that happened. So this isn't anything new. And it's kind of the same old story. And it's tiresome, having to make the case. And we only have to make the case because we have such a propaganda machine that systematically buries the evidence. And it's as if this battle begins again anew every time. Same thing I have to say with the war machine, and it's incredible how Ukraine is really reenacting kind of the Afghanistan strategy to like the 70s, where the US written policy was to kind of trick Russia into being overextended, to overextend and basically, exhaust Russia. At the time, it was the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And so the US then funded the Mujahideen and its sequel, Taliban, these terrorist movements, along with Saudi Arabia, and and Russia was induced to enter into Afghanistan, which was a disaster for the Soviet Union. And this is basically the same playbook being reenacted right now. And people may want to take a look at Jeffrey Sachs and his discussion of what's going on in foreign policy. I was kind of blown away when I telling it like it is, come hell or high water. And I'm sure he's being plotted against or whatever, he's getting listed right now, I'm sure, by the powers that be that are not happy that an academic authority who has a real command over history, he's an economist, he's head of the Sustainable Development Project for University of Columbia, has been high up in the UN, very networked guy who really knows what's going on, who really says in no uncertain terms that you just can't believe anything they say. They systematically lie and need to be, the default should be that you don't believe them. Wait for it to be proven. We have such a powerful propaganda machine.
So I want to show this clip. And Jill, I know you've seen this. I don't know if other people have, but to this point about people running like as a third party or independent candidate, there's always, the group that comes in and says, well, you're the spoiler candidate, or you're the reason why this other candidate didn't win. And like I said, that doesn't make sense, because if you look at the numbers, you do the math, Hillary still would have lost, like, regardless. But there was something that Ro Khanna said here, and this really rubbed me the wrong way. I do appreciate him coming on to have the discussion. I don't think he will come back on, but there was something he said here in reference to the third party candidates with your particular situation. And I want everybody to take a listen to this. Would win. But I still say to this day that Jill Stein was the better candidate.
Well, I supported Hillary Clinton in the general election, and I'm proud of supporting Hillary Clinton. I think that Trump was such a threat to democracy and is such a threat to democracy. Look, if Hillary Clinton had won, we would not have had Roe versus Wade overturned. So I do not agree with people who supported Jill Stein, especially in swing states, because the costing of Hillary Clinton that election really led to Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and the Supreme Court that we currently have.
That part right there, Jill.
It speaks to really the failure of the political system as we know it, that it falls to the Supreme Court to be making these decisions in the first place. If we had a Congress that could actually take positions and take votes and pass legislation, stuff like this wouldn't be defaulting to the Supreme Court in the first place. And why is it? This refers back to what I was talking about before, about why the Democrats lost their their supermajority. They lost their supermajority because they've been systematically throwing people under the bus and delivering for Wall Street and the war machine. So that's why they didn't have a supermajority, but they also could have revised the filibuster rules so that a simple majority vote could have delivered on Roe. Now, why couldn't they even do a simple majority vote? Because the Democratic establishment goes to the mat for the likes of Henry Cuellar and the likes of Joe Manchin, who each had very progressive and well-supported, exemplary opponents. And those opponents were defeated in the primaries because, by design, the Democratic Party defeats its progressives so that even when it has a majority, it still can't threaten conservative rule. And so it continues to deliver for its big corporate donors, for the war machine, for Wall Street, for fossil fuels and nuclear, for the big bosses at the workplace, and anti-worker legislation. Didn't stand up on Medicare for all, didn't stand up on the public option, which it's been promising for years, didn't stand up even for real drug reform and the drug pricing reform that is now much touted in the Inflation Reduction Act. You know what that amounts to? It amounts to 20 pharmaceuticals 4 years from now that Medicare will be able to negotiate. And the Democrats are actually running on this in the midterms. This is one of their claims to fame, is that 4 years from now, you'll have the benefit of Medicare negotiating 20 drugs out of thousands of drugs on which you are being ripped off. It's pathetic.
I agree. And one of the things too I've noticed is I've watched some of the platforms or some of the issues that were part of the Green Party's platform. I've seen the Democratic Party or progressives kind of take that and water it down. For example, the Green New Deal. I remember when AOC and Ed Markey, they were, all over TV, like, we have a Green New Deal. And all of a sudden, for people who are not familiar with the Green Party, they really thought this was a new idea. And this idea, actually, this platform actually came from the Green Party. Same thing with canceling student loan debt. A lot of people forget that you were the one that brought that up. And back then, I remember John Oliver was like, oh, that's a ridiculous idea. Now, all of a sudden, it's a good idea. So it seems like, to me, it's not so much when it comes to mainstream media, it's not really so much about the policy, it's who the policy and the message is coming from. If the policy and the message is coming from the Democratic Party, then CNN and MSNBC are all for it and Fox News is against it. If the policy is coming from the Republican Party, then Fox News is all for it and CNN and MSNBC is against it. And I wonder why more people don't wake up to this. And I want to get your opinion about that. Why do you feel more Americans are not realizing that they're just playing party politics?
I think, this speaks to the issue of the media madness, the 24/7 propaganda machine that we have, and the fact that people are just strapped trying to keep a roof over their heads, to pay their rent, to afford the skyrocketing costs now of food and fuel and rent. People are exhausted. They don't have time to do the research right now that us professional junkies, us news junkies just do. We live and breathe news and we know how to actually look for it and research it. But those sites, they don't have the reach, they don't have the breadth of mainstream media. And I'm just continually impressed at the power of the propaganda machine, which is what fascist governments have always relied on to establish and maintain their power. And we keep drifting further and further into the realm of proto-fascist and then actually fascist state. And it's quite alarming because the price that we pay now for being spoon-fed by the corporate media is disastrous. It is impoverishing us at home, and it endangers us seriously abroad. And this is where the Democrats now leading the charge on the war machine and on nuclear escalation. It is jaw-dropping. And I have to say that AOC's response to her critics sounded like McCarthyism. It was just shocking that she has become so brain dead. You know, maybe it's one of the risks of I don't want to say a young person, but someone who hasn't been tested, who's first dipping their toes in the political waters, and she doesn't have any stamina, and she's just really bowed to the pressure inside DC, inside capitals, inside the political elites. It's just wrong to even think that we have a democracy. We are a plutocracy. We are really run by a small group of the wealthy who really controls our political system and our media system. And it really requires a very broad movement. It requires our many movements to join arms and work together, because there are a lot of us, but divided and conquered, we are powerless. But as we work together on a bigger vision for true democracy, peace, and social, economic, and racial justice, they all have to go together, and climate justice too. You can't solve one of these without the other. And again, I have to keep going back to the war. I'm obsessed with the war right now because I feel very personally at risk for me and everybody I know, and for my kids, my grandkids, and everybody's. The rate of escalation right now is absolutely staggering, and the lack of insight is staggering. What we're going through right now has often been compared to the Cuban Missile Crisis, except it's kind of in reverse right now. But it is that dangerous. It is an equally dangerous moment. But the difference is that we had leadership that was capable of recognizing a problem. And who did I hear? I think it was Jeffrey Sachs, actually, that I heard talking about this on some Google video last night, where he was talking about the Cuban Missile. It might have been on Mass Peace Action. They have a great website with some really good resources on war, and especially nuclear war. But I feel like it's so important for people to come to terms with this quickly. And one of the things that this video, which I think was on their website, points out is that at least Khrushchev, he did a reckless thing by putting missiles in Cuba, in the same way that we in NATO are doing a very reckless thing by putting missiles right on the border of Russia. This is absolutely untenable. It threatens the existential, existence of the countries involved. And in the same way that we were ready to go to nuclear war over that, Russia would potentially be, although they haven't actually made a statement to that effect, although it's been assumed, but that's questioned by people who actually speak Russian and who do their research on this. But at the time, the missiles were heading and the warheads were on their way to Cuba. And Fidel Castro was saying, fire them, fire them. And Khrushchev looked at that and he said, holy crap, no, we should not go to nuclear war over this. And he kind of realized that he had overplayed his hand, and he signed up to negotiate right away. And so it was the crisis was really, it was diminished right away, and talks began. Now you have nothing like that going on. You have both sides standing their ground, although Russia has repeatedly offered to negotiate.
Yep.
And the US has repeatedly refused to negotiate, and just mocked and refused to take seriously the threat that Russia was experiencing, which we should recognize as the very threat that we would feel if China or Russia were to be placing missiles on our border, either place. So, we need to sit down and negotiate. And there's one other point I want to make, which is not only that the U.S. has blocked negotiations, and this is now reported by several observers, that Ukraine and Russia were actually well on their way to a 15 or 16 point peace plan. When Boris Johnson was sent in, this was in March and April of this year, Boris Johnson, they were agreeing. And even Ukraine was saying that Crimea was up for discussion. He had really backed off, and Russia was willing to withdraw troops. And it was essentially a reenactment of the Minsk Accords, which Russia was always on board for, but the US never pushed. And while Zelensky was elected on a peace platform overwhelmingly and was elected to further the Minsk Accords, he needed support because thanks to the Maidan coup, there was a strong Nazi element. They may not have been numerous, but they had some strength. So Zelensky needed US support in order to push for peace, and we refused to give it. So there we were again in March and April when a peace solution was actually on the table. We sent in Boris Johnson to basically destroy it. And the background to all of this is that we have a declared policy of full spectrum dominance that does not tolerate either military or economic competitors. And this is laid out in very clear terms repeatedly. And I was really shocked today because I was like looking back. So where did full spectrum dominance get articulated? We know that it was part of this 2017 Joint Chiefs of Staff document, where it says basically we will not tolerate economic competitors. It's called like post-primacy world. How does the US operate in a post-primacy world? And their answer to that question is by essentially suppressing by force, if necessary, all potential economic and military competitors. We will strike them down. We are going to maintain US hegemony. We are going to continue to be a one power world, a unipolar world, rather than the multipolar world that we actually are right now. So I was looking for, well, where did this start? And it turns out the New York Times has an article about the Pentagon's formal statement in 1992, okay? The very year following the dissolution of the USSR. The Pentagon is basically saying the same thing. So the elephant in the room here is that we're not only like preventing a peace accord from the get-go, we have been dedicated to maintaining US sole power. And the empire does not tolerate people who even say that, which is why I'm regularly smeared as a Putin puppet, and I'm sure you guys are too. So yeah, it's so important to fight the propaganda machine, because the propaganda machine is not only robbing us blind, it's advocating for nuclear war. And few people know that when a nuclear weapon, if you go to the US websites now, the US now has this ready.gov website. I can post it after this talk if you're interested. But they have this website now advising you. It's like duck and cover back in the 1950s and 60s. It is little better than duck and cover. And it's just a joke. They're saying like, well, don't look at the light when the bomb detonates. It could make you blind for a few seconds. Well, the truth is it will melt your eyeballs. And furthermore, that you will be vaporized, if you're anywhere within like 4 to 8 miles, depending on how large the bomb is. But the public is being so purposefully miseducated right now to think that nuclear war is survivable, or that it's only in the blast zone. And how big is the blast zone? Well, for like a 20 megaton bomb, which is not the biggest, it's a big bomb, but it's not as big as they are. That blast zone is about 4-mile radius from where the bomb goes off. So that's like an 8-mile diameter that reaches within 1/1000th of a second. It reaches 20 million degrees Fahrenheit, and it generates a blast wind of about 650 miles an hour. So if you're not immediately burned up, you're going to be completely, smashed to smithereens. Even bomb shelters deep underground will be crushed by the impact of such a thing. So let's stop pretending that it is survivable, let alone the nuclear winter that would follow. And basically we all go from starvation at that point because you don't have sufficient sunlight to grow food for years following even a modest exchange of nuclear weapons on the order of 100 or 200 nuclear weapons. And remember, we have something like, 6,000 each, somewhere around that, 5,000 or 6,000 nuclear weapons each. And the really, there are so many scary little details here, but there are ways in which firing one nuke triggers firing back lots of them. And so this thing could just totally go up in flames quickly. We shouldn't be anywhere near the discussion. And for Joe Biden to say that nuclear Armageddon is a possibility is a complete, it's a total trashing of his role as a world leader, that this disaster has been allowed to progress to this point. It has to be turned around quickly. And it's really important for people to be educated about it's not over there. Nuclear war is not over there. It's here too. Not to mention that Russia has some really fast missiles right now that we do not have and that we're kind of defenseless against. So stop pretending that nuclear threats or even conventional threats are over there. War is no longer over there. It's right here. And we need to think about whether we are willing to sacrifice our lives. War is no longer something that someone fights for us. We are fighting it, whether we like it or not. We are going to be the victims of it. So let's take the power that belongs to us and say, end. That's it. You are not sentencing us to a nuclear conflagration or any other needless conflagration, whether it's nuclear, whether it's conventional, whether it is economic, or whether it's climate. We are really at the brink of extinction right now from many different causes. And we don't have to be here. This is purely for the sake of the ruling elites. So it's time to take back the power through every means possible. And I'm talking peaceful means here, but there are many peaceful means that are possible.
That's right. Another thing I want to mention too, in reference to foreign policy with the U.S. I'm just going to mute for a second. For foreign policy with the U.S. Government, for those who are not aware, is also trying to invade Haiti right now. We've been talking about that the past 2 weeks. They've also escalated tensions with China by these visits that they've made to Taiwan. And I don't care what Nancy Pelosi says, but that visit that she made to Taiwan, and also Ed Markey too, by the way, who kind of flew under the radar, but he also went over there. That all that did is cause an escalation with tensions among, China and the United States, because I don't care why they went over there. The fact that they went there, that sends a message to China during a time when Taiwan is trying to fight for independence from China. And so for people who are not aware, Taiwan is a part of China. It is not a separate entity. So I feel like a lot of times the United States government just escalates issues that could have otherwise been prevented.
Absolutely. And that reverses some, many decades, 40, 50 years of explicit U.S. policy, a one China policy that we deal with mainland China, not two different Chinas that are then going to be competing with each other. So, yeah, this is just another case in point of U.S. cluelessness and the Cold War that's being ramped up right now against China. And how clueless is it to take on two global powers at the same time. I mean, even if you thought that those Cold Wars had merit, which they don't, they're destructive and dumb and just kind of suicidal. Even if you thought they had merit, it's like, how unstrategic is it to like take them both on at the same time? What we've basically done is solidified the BRIC alliance: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And Turkey may be heading in that way too. But the BRICS coalition, it's an economic coalition, but it's also increasingly a political coalition. And, you know, when the US is putting, what is it, like half or 2/3 of the world population under sanctions, we're not buying ourselves a lot of friends. And when we insist on having sole economic domination over the world, we are also not buying a lot of friends. So inevitably, you begin to see the other powers in the world begin to come together. And the conflict in Ukraine has really solidified the Russia-China alliance. That's one of the reasons that Henry Kissinger, of all people, you know, Mr. Conservatism himself, you know, is vehemently opposed to, you know, to this absurd US-Russia proxy war, because it is driving together China and Russia, which is something that the US security establishment tried to prevent for decades. You know, above all else, don't let Russia and China get together. Well, we have really kind of blessed that marriage now in holy water, and they are getting together. And I just saw on Jeffrey Sachs's website these very interesting statistics. Like, not only does BRICS have a huge majority of the world's people, they have something like 41%. We have, together with the G7, we have like 6 or 7%. They've got 41. And then if you look at GDP, the BRICS GDP has just now bypassed ours with the G7. So we are fighting a losing proposition here, and you don't want to, you know, be introducing a lot of violence and decimating the the body of international law that provided some basis for real stability. And, you know, back in the 1990s, if you read this old Pentagon document that really sort of declares war on all other competitors, at the time they were still talking about international law. Now they don't talk about international law. Now they talk about the rules-based order, talking about US rules. You know, they're talking about the rules-based order. And you don't want to be introducing might makes right at the very time that we are losing the might. You know, it's like, even if you were just doing this out of self-serving purposes, it's not the time to do it. You know, we need a you know, a body of international law based on you know, on justice and human rights, which is what was intended. It's gone off course, but, you know, that was intended in the body of law that came out of the Second World War and with the UN. And of course, there's a big power grab within the UN with the Security Council and all that right now. But this is not a time to be, you know, pushing might makes right. It's just,
right.
It's wrong. And it means we have to overcome the propaganda machine, and it is a big tribute to the Revolutionary Blackout Network, because you are so eloquent and courageous and just telling it like it is to everyday people who, you know, really are the drivers and who are the alternative to the elite that are driving us over a cliff right now.
All right, Joe, I have 2 quick questions for you, because I see Nick in the background, but in reference to implementing progressive policies, so we're both in Massachusetts. I've been telling people that some of these progressive policies that were a part of Bernie Sanders' platform, we've already implemented here in Massachusetts. So I've been encouraging people like to try to do some of these things locally within your state. For example, the $15 minimum wage we passed years ago here. So like Bernie Sanders was kind of late with that. I know last year, last year was the year that paid family leave started in Massachusetts. We legalized marijuana here, and there are, cannabis shops all across the state now. So it seems like in order to, if people really want these progressive policies faster, it seems like you can get it done faster through the state on the local level.
Yes. I think there's all kinds of reasons to focus on the state and local level. And it's going to be very hard to force change at the national level until we build up the power for that change at the local and state level. So yes, I agree. At the same time, Massachusetts stops us dead in our tracks. We came very close to passing, it's called single payer. This was again around 2000, and the single payer, Medicare for all, as it's known now, had the numbers and the people, but we were outspent like 50-1, and they pushed it back. Massachusetts used to have a peace delegation. They've now gone over to the dark side, as you were mentioning about, one of our Markey, our senator, who used to be kind of a mainstay of the peace community. He's now heading over to Taiwan and, cheerleading the second Cold War as well as the first one, So it's not, it's not foolproof and it's not easy, but yeah, I really agree with your point that we should be organizing at the state level. At the same time, I think there is value challenging because we can't give them a pass. I don't think we should give them a pass. But, for myself, I feel like the priorities are increasingly at the state and level. And across states, I can't tell if, let's see. All right. And fighting at the state level and networking across states so that we can share, best practices and what works and just build capacity and get to critical mass.
Okay, and awesome. And one last quick question. I know the answer to this, but for people who are not aware, Jill, could you explain to the audience why you personally will not be primarying against within the Democratic Party and unseating him as the Dem nominee in 2024? Basically, he's asking why you're not running in 2024.
So I could be running in 2024, but not for that office, just because I think we need a real win. We need a real fight and a real win. And if I'm looking at the correct question, why not challenge within the Democratic Party? Because if you are a true challenge, number one, they will ensure that you do not get the nomination in the same way that they rigged the nomination away from Bernie Sanders twice, who really had the power and who could have arguably had a much better chance of beating Trump. So they won't allow it. And that also has been going on for many, many, many decades. That goes back to the win of the anti-war candidate, George McGovern, back in, this 1972 or something like that, when George McGovern was defeated. He won only Massachusetts. So because the Democrats abandoned him, when he won the primary, they abandoned him and worked for the other side. So Democrats have just proven what they will do. We know their game plan too well. It's just not worth the time and energy. And the problem is when you try to have a revolution inside of a counter-revolutionary party, what happens is that they will shut you down, they will defeat you, and then you have nothing. The castle in the sand has just been washed away by the ocean, and you got to start all over again and build a whole new force. That's why I think it's important, and Bree makes this point also. Brianna Joy Gray also makes this point. You have to build, and if you're challenging from outside the Democratic Party, then you have a base on which you continue to build. And my final comment is that, there are powerful forces at play here, and some of them are the political and economic elites, but they are not the last force. And we have a lot of people power here, but it's not organized, but we can organize it. But there's also the forces of the economy and the climate and war. And those will force dramatic transformations in public opinion that will come like that, out of the blue. You're not ready for it. You don't know it's coming, but you want to be ready for whatever happens that's going to change the cards on the table. The cards on the table are going to be changed by the course of history, and history is extremely unstable right now and doing some very crazy things. So we want to be ready to harness that political momentum when the universe in all of its wisdom generates that political momentum just out of the course of history and this very dangerous trajectory that we are on right now. Things are going to change. The times they are changing. And we want to be on the right side of history, building the infrastructure right now, socially and politically. We want to be building the infrastructure for democratically taking power back from the economic elites and creating a world and an America that works for all of us.